Woodstock was a musical landmark and the festival to play at in the summer of 1969. 500,000 hippies and 32 musical acts showed up, but some big stars were missing. So why didn't the Beatles and a lot of other legends play at Woodstock? In this video, we'll talk about some notable bands and artists who missed the concert and why they didn't go. Some of the reasons are pretty interesting. You can judge for yourself whether or not it was a good decision to miss Woodstock. Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you dig this video, please click like and subscribe. It's a huge help. In the summer of 1969, the Jeff Beck Group were on a tour of the United States in support of their album Beck, which had reached number 15 on the Billboard 200 album chart. The band played the Fillmore East and then the Newport Jazz Festival. Rod Stewart recalls how the last date on the trip was scheduled to be, quote, some outdoor event or another in upstate New York. In fact, they were booked to play at Woodstock. So why didn't they play? Well, the band was touring and making hit records successfully, but apparently there was significant infighting. Consider this: a month before Woodstock, in July 1969, Rod Stewart went into the studio to record his debut solo album. If that wasn't bad enough, he also brought with him Ron Wood and drummer Mickey Waller from the Jeff Beck Group. So suffice to say, there were high tensions in the band. The bulk of the tour was done, and the Jeff Beck Group had a few days off in the week leading up to Woodstock. They were staying at a hotel at JFK Airport, waiting to drive upstate to the farm, play at the show, and then return home to end the tour. Rod Stewart was hanging out in his room when he got a call. Jeff Beck was gone. Turns out, Beck had somehow gotten wind of a rumor that his quote-unquote missus was having an affair with the gardener. Now, I need to mention here that Jeff Beck at the time was not married, so Rod Stewart must be talking about his girlfriend. So Jeff Beck flew home early, dashing the band's chance to play at Woodstock and simultaneously putting an end to the Jeff Beck Group. And in the end, the rumor of an affair turned out to be false. So did they regret it? Rod Stewart says, well, you've seen one outdoor festival, you've seen them all. Ronnie Wood also says he has no regrets, saying, hey, it was meant to be. But Jeff Beck, however, named missing Woodstock as one of his greatest regrets. Joni Mitchell was the writer of the iconic song Woodstock, which Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young covered on their incredible Deja Vu album. But Joni wasn't there herself. She wrote the song based on stories her boyfriend, Graham Nash, told her, and some news reports of the festival she'd seen on TV. Joni missed it because her agent recommended that she appear on Dick Cavett's show rather than at Woodstock. But it's a bit more complicated than that. It's believed that Mitchell was discouraged from performing at more festivals after an unpleasant episode at Atlantic City Pop Festival on August 1st, 1969. Some accounts said a particularly nasty crowd made her rush from the stage in tears. But the Philadelphia Inquirer's Jack Lloyd reported it a little bit differently. He said folk singer Joni Mitchell had them in the palm of her hand. More than 25,000 festive-minded youths were on hand Friday for the opening session of the Atlantic City Pop Festival, and Joni Mitchell was beautiful. It could have been the high spot of the evening, but she appeared on stage for less than 15 minutes, long enough to sing 4 songs. And that was a pity because she sang them beautifully and everyone seemed anxious for more of the same. Joni sang Cactus Flower, and midway through the number there was a sign of trouble. She interrupted her song to gently tell her audience, I sang that verse twice and nobody noticed. She finished the song and sang 2 more, and then Joni left the stage. Some people said she looked visibly upset, but that was it. So yeah, that's why Joni Mitchell didn't play at Woodstock. It seems her manager thought she might not be up to it, and that the Dick Cavett show would be a better bet at that time. In the summer of 1969, Iron Butterfly's heavy second album, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, was at number 4 on the Billboard 200. Like many of the other acts, they had trouble getting to the venue. The band ended up stranded at the airport and had to reach out to the festival organizers for help. Festival co-creator Michael Lang, in his book Road to Woodstock, wrote, Iron Butterfly was booked for Sunday afternoon, but John Morris told me that their agent had called with a last-minute demand for a helicopter to pick them up. We will fly to LaGuardia. You will have helicopters pick us up. We will fly straight to the show. We will perform immediately. And then we will be flown out. So I picked up the phone, got a cooperative lady at Western Union, and said, for reasons I can't go into, until you are here, clarifying your situation, knowing you are having problems, You will have to find other transportation unless you plan not to come. And so that's why Iron Butterfly didn't play at Woodstock. Lighthouse was an award-winning Canadian jazz, classical, rock fusion band, and they were booked to play at Woodstock, but the band backed out for fear that Woodstock would be a bad scene. Even though they went on to have a lot of success, Lighthouse founder Skip Prokop lists missing the festival as one of his greatest regrets. He said in an interview, "I knew it was going to be one big drug fest. I thought, you're not going to be able to get a glass of water without having something in it." And you know what? If you saw our other video about Woodstock, you'll know he was not wrong. Led Zeppelin was asked to perform, but manager Peter Grant decided they'd just be another band at the festival. So instead, Grant coordinated a far more profitable summer tour stop in New Jersey. Zeppelin lead singer Robert Plant said, "Our management thought we'd be typecast." Zeppelin would play more than 40 gigs on their summer '69 tour of the US. On the weekend of Woodstock, Zeppelin played the Asbury Park Convention Hall in New Jersey, just south of the festival. At Asbury Park Convention Hall, they did 2 evening shows, 7:30 and 9:45, as was typical. Seats cost $5.50 and $4.50 and $2.50 for standing room tickets. The opening act was a young British blues rocker named Joe Cocker. Glenn Partush was 12 years old in 1969, but he was already working at the convention hall, hawking programs during the show. He remembers that the 7:30 p.m. Zeppelin show was not sold out. You could still walk up to the door and buy a ticket for $5.50, he said, but the second one was pretty much sold out. After seeing Zeppelin play, Partush got their debut album the following day. So Zeppelin likely had no issues being paid for the gig, and the logistics were likely a lot easier than flying in a helicopter to Woodstock. And you know what? Missing Woodstock does not seem to have hurt Zeppelin. Their album that dropped that year reached number 10 on the Billboard charts in the US and peaked at number 6 in the UK. And their pairing of blues, folk, and psychedelia eventually would make them one of the biggest bands of the 70s, if not the biggest. Jim Morrison had several on-stage run-ins with the law. The first happened in 1967 when Jim and a fan were canoodling in a space backstage, and a cop, not realizing he was the talent, tried to kick them out. When Jim told the cop twice to eat it, he and the fan both ended up sprayed with mace, and Jim went to jail. In March 1969, Morrison had his second on-stage run-in with the law in Miami. The Doors had a show at Dinner Key Theater in Coconut Grove. Morrison, emboldened by a fresh exposure to the living theater, was, let's say, creatively confrontational to both the crowd and to the police surrounding the stage. Suffice to say, it's actually amazing that the Doors got invited to play at Woodstock at all after all this drama, but they were. Apparently, his issues with behavior were not the problem. The Doors actually were the ones who declined an invite to play at Woodstock. Some speculation points to Jim Morrison's dislike for performing outdoors. He didn't like to play outdoors. Other people say that Morrison thought he would be murdered. Jim refused to play outside because of a genuine belief that there'd be snipers that would get too good of a shot. But according to the band's guitarist, Robbie Krieger, the Doors were closed to Woodstock just simply because they were stupid and turned it down. They thought it would be a second-class repeat of Monterey Pop. Doors drummer John Densmore did appear at Woodstock, however. Not as a drummer, but as a fan. He can be seen on the side of the stage during Joe Cocker's set. Did you know you can rent Big Pink? Bob Dylan moved to this iconic house outside Woodstock in the early 1960s. He was drawn to the town's creative and bohemian atmosphere, and he quickly became a fixture in the local music scene. Dylan's time at the house called Big Pink was brief but influential. He recorded some of his most famous songs while living there, including the Music from the Big Pink album with the band, and the basement tapes. Unfortunately, when you rent the house, you don't have access to the basement, so you can't show up with your band and record your album there. In the summer of 1969, Dylan was in the middle of negotiations to perform at the upcoming Woodstock Festival when his son fell ill. So, Bob bowed out due to family obligations. He was also reportedly quite unimpressed with the growing number of hippies who were camping outside his home. I suspect that helped with the decision. Dylan went on to perform at the Isle of Wight Festival 2 weeks later. Procol Harum were building a following, and their signature hit, A Whiter Shade of Pale, was getting significant airplay on the radio and on college campuses, so they would have been a great addition to the Woodstock Festival. The band was invited, but ultimately declined because the festival was happening at the end of a long tour. In addition, the impending birth of band member Robin Trower's son took precedence over what at the time seemed to be just another festival gig. The Moody Blues was just starting to make it big in the 1960s. As such, they were invited to play Woodstock, and they're listed on the early posters. But Woodstock wasn't the only festival happening that summer. Like now, many European cities hosted musical festivals of their own, and the Moody Blues decided that it made much more sense for them to continue to tour European festivals that summer, rather than doing a one-off in the US. You see, the Moody Blues had a solid European fan base, and they chose to foster that fan base. So the weekend of Woodstock, they did a festival in Paris instead. Now, I can't really find any information about that show or pictures of it or anything, so if you know anything about it, please comment below. Jethro Tull passed on Woodstock after band leader Ian Anderson was quoted as saying that he didn't, quote, want to spend his weekend in a field of unwashed hippies, end quote. Talk about the pot calling the kettle unwashed. Anderson later explained the decision to songfacts.com, saying, "The reason I didn't want to play Woodstock is because I asked our manager, Terry Ellis, well, who else is going to be there? And he listed a large number of groups who were reputedly going to play, and that it was going to be a hippie festival. And I said, will there be lots of naked ladies? And will there be taking drugs and drinking lots of beer and fooling around in the mud? Because rain was forecast." And he said, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Right, well then I don't want to go, because I don't like hippies, and I'm usually rather put off by naked ladies unless the time is right." Well, indeed, unless the money's right. Another theory is the belief that the large festival may have killed their career before it began. I don't know if that holds much weight. What do you think? Frank Zappa of Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention said, "A lot of mud at Woodstock. We were invited to play there and we turned it down." Zappa also famously did not take drugs, which were a major component at Woodstock, let's face it. Zappa told Circus Raves in 1975, all the hippies were so impressed with themselves they didn't know which end was up. So basically, for Zappa, it came down to personal preference. He didn't do drugs and he didn't really like hippies. Sometimes it just comes down to a miscommunication in the moment leading up to a poorly informed decision. Tommy James and the Shondells declined the invitation. Tommy James remembers, "We were in Hawaii and my secretary called and said, well listen, there's this pig farmer in upstate New York that wants you to play in his field." That's how it was put to me. A pig farmer in upstate New York wants you to play in his field. So we passed. In retrospect, we could have really kicked ourselves. Love is an American rock band that was formed in Los Angeles in 1965. Led by frontman and primary songwriter Arthur Lee, they were one of the first racially diverse American rock bands. The band had modest commercial success with their 1966 single 7 and 7 Is, but their 67 album, Forever Changes, has become a 1960s touchstone for critics and music lovers. It stands out as a highlight of their career. By this time, however, tensions were arising between Arthur Lee and guitarist and singer Brian McLean, who wanted more of his songs on their album. Once they finished recording the record, McLean departed the band, and Arthur Lee dismissed the rest of the group. He later reformed the band with the cast of new players, but it had a different feel and it never quite rose to the level of Forever Changes. Arthur Lee and Love dropped 2 albums in 1969, and their 1970 effort would even feature an appearance from Hendrix himself. But despite this, they declined the invitation to Woodstock. According to Mojo magazine, it was continued inner turmoil within the band, which caused their absence. While the Beatles were putting finishing touches on their Abbey Road album, the Woodstock Music Festival was scheduled to take place on a dairy farm in Bethel, New York. The Beatles were heavily rumored to be appearing or at least attending the 3-day event, but it never happened. Michael Lang really wanted the Beatles, but of course he realized that they would have overpowered the bill. They'd also stopped touring by this time. But John Lennon was a huge influence on him, so Michael Lang had to try. He reached out to John through Apple's Chris O'Dell. They had a mutual acquaintance. Miss O'Dell sent a memo about the concert to John and Yoko. John said he was not interested in playing, but he would like to go see it, but alas, it was not to be. In May, John was barred from entering the U.S. due to his 1968 arrest in London for possession of marijuana. By the time August 1969 came around, the Beatles were rushing to finish the Abbey Road album. In a letter to Michael Lang, dated July 7, 1969, Chris O'Dell indicated that Apple wanted to present the following talent to Woodstock: the Plastic Ono Band, Billy Preston, and James Taylor. Apple also wanted a booth to promote Apple products and to show a color film by Mr. and Mrs. John Lennon. It's not stated what the film was that John and Yoko wanted to show. Chris O'Dell's letter went on to explain that the Plastic Ono Band would be, quote, a series of plastic cylinders incorporated around a stereo sound system, as depicted on the Give Peace a Chance picture sleeve. The July 12th NME reported that John and Yoko were considering attending Woodstock if the U.S. Embassy would grant an entry visa to John. There was also talk of John and Yoko fronting an American assembled group. There is no record of any follow-up to any of these communications, and in the end, Apple Records and the Beatles had no presence at Woodstock. Ringo says they regretted missing it. There were plans, Ringo wistfully told Canadian Entertainment Tonight. We were going to fly in with a helicopter. The Stones were at the top of their game in 1969, of course. They were one of the world's biggest rock bands. So of course they were invited to Woodstock. But you know what? It wasn't a great summer for the Stones in general. On June 8th, Mick, Keith, and Charlie Watts had to fire founding member Brian Jones, who was no longer able to work or tour due to his drug habits and convictions. Less than a month later, July 3rd, 1969, Jones drowned in his swimming pool. He had been replaced by Mick Taylor, and the band hardly skipped a beat, but it had to be a really difficult time. Then frontman Mick Jagger made the decision for the rest of the band. They would skip the Woodstock Festival, the festival that would be proclaimed the defining moment of the age, so that Mick could go to Australia to shoot a movie that no one remembers. Ned Kelly has a score of 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. I've never seen it. When organizers tried to replicate the Woodstock moment months later in Altamont, California, the Rolling Stones were center stage. Security was provided by Hells Angels gang members, and a black man in the audience was killed. For many, that horrible moment marked the end of the decade of peace and love. If you dug that video, check out this one about CBGBs, or this other one that was selected specifically for you by an algorithm that's smarter than both of us.